My brief remarks deal basically with the what I believe to be one of the challenges for 2012, which is the need, as I see, to revisit the 2003 EU strategy against WMD proliferation. This said, while focusing on the WMD proliferation strategy, some elements do indeed apply as well to other disarmament and conventional proliferation policies that we have developed within the EU. Dear friends, 2013 is coming up very soon, in 11 months' time. Our strategy dates back from 2003. For me, it looks like normal that we revisit after 10 years a strategy. After all, that's what happened also at NATO, where I had the privilege to work for a while. And it also happens rather frequently in another big power, which is the US, where the latest revisiting occurred in 2010. So that is one element that calls for the need to be open-minded about revisiting our 2003 strategy. The other one, obviously, is that we've done that work in 2003 with 15 EU member states, whereas today and tomorrow actually will be 28 EU members. I believe it is a matter of courtesy to imply more fully and more respectfully all of the EU member states in this important exercise. Now, revisiting is not necessarily redrafting. It is reanalyzing. The EU security strategy of 2003 would also be open for revisiting. As far as I understand from discussions within the EU and amongst the 27 today, there seems to be rather a reluctance to reopen it, the security strategy. Now, that may complicate, of course, the exercise that I'm pleading for, that is that we would revisit the non-proliferation strategy. Why? Because our WMD proliferation strategy is actually part and parcel of our overall EU strategic concept. So the two go hand in hand. And if you reopen one, obviously, you should also reopen the other. The second element is that revisiting is not necessarily a form of criticism or negative attitude. The strategy in 2003 was elaborated in very specific circumstances. I know a little bit about this, having been involved with it in those days. And actually, the real origin occurred under the Belgian presidency of 2010, of 2001. It was related to 9/11, when we started looking at EU policy in disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control environments, taking into account the very specific challenge of terrorism as it occurred in the US on 9/11. 2003 was also, of course, the year of Iraq and the US military campaign there. And indeed, that campaign caused a lot of turmoil in terms of transatlantic relations and fallout also within the EU itself. And also that is reflected in the strategy. I would like to call your attention to one paragraph in particular, paragraph 15 in the 2003 document, which says at the end that the measures that the EU would contemplate when political dialogue and diplomatic pressure would have failed, coercive measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and international law, sanctions, Iran, selective or global, interceptions of shipments, PSI, and as appropriate, and now it comes, the use of force could be envisioned. Now, this is rather revolutionary in terms of EU language, the EU being classically, traditionally seen as, the soft power where even mentioning words like the use of force is not done. It was done in 2003, and the reason for that is simply to be found in the very complicated relationship we had as EU 15 then with the United States over the Iraq issue. Also, the EU working methods then were fundamentally different. We worked in various working groups, COARM, CODUN, CONOP. The dual-use working party was involved. So at the end of the day, it all ended up a bit like some sort of a patchwork, like the cut and paste method that some of us do use, also in our academic environment occasionally. Little overall management happened. There was a rotating presidency. So at least, 3 EU countries were involved in steering the vehicle towards the end result in December 2003. Now, this said, and that's why I come back to the fact that it's not all about criticism, I'm very happy to see that some of the elements contained in our EU strategy of 2003 did influence the United States, for instance, in the drafting process that led to its 2010 strategic review. Elements such as multilateralism and partnerships, or the attention for the root causes, power by example, the reference to values, the balanced approach, non-proliferation and disarmament, is to be found in the 2010 US strategy. And in many cases, you'll find very clear references to what we already foresaw in 2003. At the same time, I believe that the EU can also learn from the US 2010 strategy. I'll come back to that later in greater detail. I don't have time for that, but I still have to go through some motions here. There are 3 elements I would like to propose for consideration. The first one around objectives, the second one around the environment, and the third one around the tools. So, one, we have to revisit the objectives. First of all, we have to develop a better narrative as EU in a way that means, really come up with a mission statement for 2013. That could read like work for a safer world for all in which we protect the safety, the interests, and the values of the EU and its citizens. The relationship between diplomacy and force should be revisited, as well as the relationship between objective analysis, such, as what is being done, like in the case of Iran, through the IAEA, and the political interpretations which unavoidably occur when you discuss the same issues at the level of the UN Security Council. There should be a balance between non-proliferation and disarmament. There should be a clear reference to the rule of law and respect for the authority of the Security Council. Second point in the objectives, a better distinction between the threats coming from state actors, state-sponsored terrorism, and non-state actors. Right now, the text reads too fuzzy. It was too much influenced by the 9/11 events. Third, a better distinguishing between our non-proliferation foreign policy, the outreach that we are doing as EU towards third countries, and the internal organization in terms of WMD proliferation, that is the in-reach, that we are very good at, where the two go hand in hand. And finally, also the whole of government approach, and that is very much also what the US is calling for in its 2010 strategy. I give you 2 examples. CBRN threat protection programs, the second line of defense, should be part and parcel also of our strategy. A linkage between civilian and military programs. I give you 2 examples. There are more and more political civilian missions of the EU. There are more and more battle group deployments considered by the EU. The second revisiting occurs with regard to the environment in which the EU operates. We need to do that with an open and critical mind. And I refer you to, I don't have time to go into detail here, to a very good analysis which was done by Daniel Korski from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Very critical with regard to the EU. Look at the outer world, globalization, the emerging powers. I mean, we talk in our 2003 strategy about relations specifically with Japan, with Canada. Not one word about India, about China, about Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and so on. This is clearly missing. There's a marginalization of the EU occurring. François referred to that before. Look at the whole discussion about the EU status resolution in the UN General Assembly. And this regardless of the massive EU financial support given to certain states and certain regions, yet those countries voted against specific representation rights for the EU within the UN General Assembly context. Post-2003, we've seen developments at the level of the Security Council, Resolution 1540 in 2004, 1887 in 2009. The Nuclear Security Summit process started in 2009 and is leading us at least till 2014. All those elements influenced our dealing with non-NPT states, and also that should filter into our EU strategy in the future. Interact with countries outside the multilateral scenes that we are most accustomed with, be it the CWC, the BTWC, the NPT, or the CTBTO. Some states simply do not belong to those groupings, and yet we have to deal with them. The question is how. Efficient multilateralism, again, is a red thread throughout our strategy, but this concept is fundamentally changing. It's outdated. Where can the EU act most efficiently today? That is not necessarily in these classical multilateral environments. It's going to be much more in plurinational formats, ad hoc coalitions built around specific themes. The G20 is a key example of that, a foreboding of fundamental reform at the level of the UN Security Council. We must invest more in 21st century centers of influence, as the US is calling it in its 2010 strategy. Regional settings, Asian, GCC, the Arab League, are fundamental interlocutors for the EU. Not the EU alone, but the EU in partnership. That is the message for the future. I spare you the whole discussion about the revolution inside of the EU, the financial crisis, the intergovernmental recuperation, the whole problem about consensus building at 27. Maastricht created a financial union without a political and economic governance union. Lisbon, on the other hand, created a political union without a financial or economic governance union. Neither of the two seems to be working well. The creation of the EES, European External Action Service, offers a tremendous opportunity, but cannot and will not happen in a vacuum. The foreign policy of the EU is not and will never be a substitution for national foreign policy, but an element of complementarity. My final words deal with the revisiting of the tools. And there, I believe it's very important that we realize the dramatic situation in which we find ourselves in today in terms of budget lines. We have to keep a very open mind, both on the CFSP budget and on the Stability Fund budget. There's an impressive amount of money involved today in EU support programs, but we should have the courage to evaluate the return upon investment as well. Spend less, but spend wisely. And again, that comes literally, spend taxpayers' money wisely from the US 2010 strategic concepts. The EES offers a perspective of a more integrated approach. I agree with that. It involves more than before the Commission colleagues. But we should also interact with the regional working groups within the EU. A whole-of-government approach is needed. The consequences, for instance, of the non-proliferation clauses in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, so-called essential clauses, needs to be revisited. Are they indeed essential clauses? What are the consequences if our trade partners are not respecting these clauses? And finally, the new lines for action, which come to an end in December 2012, in my view, offered the ideal opportunity to indeed open at 27 countries of the EU this issue of revisiting our strategy of 2003. I apologize for being somewhat long. Thank you.